I was driving back to San Jose from San Francisco late one January night years ago, taking the 280 freeway. If you've driven it, you'll know it feels like you're cutting through the edge of the world. The mountains rising like sleeping giants to one side, pitch black skies stretching endlessly above. There are no streetlights out there, just your headlights slicing through the darkness. That night, the road was mostly mine, save for a few cars that drifted in and out of view. I was cruising at about 80, maybe 85 miles per hour. The stretch of freeway seemed infinite, just the hum of my tires and the faint rush of wind through my cracked window. I felt oddly detached, as though the car was gliding through space, and everything beyond the beams of my headlights didn't exist. But as I rounded a bend, the road ahead snapped into sharp reality. Two mangled cars appeared in my path, twisted like crushed soda cans. Shattered glass glittered on the asphalt, and scraps of metal littered the lanes. The crash must have been recent. Smoke still curled lazily from one of the hoods. Instinct took over, and I slammed on the brakes, yanking the wheel hard to the right. My car jerked violently, tires screeching as I barely avoided plowing into the wreckage. My heart was pounding by the time I straightened out and glanced back in the rearview mirror. The scene looked unreal, like something out of a movie. Both cars sat at awkward angles, their shapes distorted beyond recognition. One of them had its front end completely caved in, its engine exposed and smoldering. The other was flipped onto its side, its undercarriage smeared with dirt and oil. What struck me wasn't the carnage itself, but the emptiness around it. There were no people, no driver waving for help, no passengers climbing out of the wreckage, no one standing by the roadside. Even the car's headlights were dead, their broken beams pointing uselessly into the void. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that the drivers might have been thrown from their vehicles, but there was no sign of that either. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and silent. I considered pulling over, but I didn't. Maybe it was the shock, maybe it was the way the scene felt, wrong, like something I shouldn't be a part of. I pressed the accelerator instead, leaving the wreckage behind. My car sped back into the darkness, the incident replaying in my mind like a scratched record. But as I drove on, unease began to creep in. I hadn't passed another car since I'd left the crash site. For a stretch of freeway that long, even late at night, it felt unnatural. My phone sat in the cup holder beside me, its screen dark. I reached for it, thinking I should call for help or at least report the accident, but I hesitated. What could I even say? That I'd seen two smashed cars with no sign of life around them. The road ahead curved, and for a moment, my high beam swept across the mountainside. I thought I caught a glimpse of something. A shadow, maybe, moving in the distance. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving me wondering if it had been there at all. My grip on the wheel tightened. Minutes passed. Still no cars, no roadside signs, no exits. The freeway seemed endless, stretching like a ribbon through the mountains. I told myself I'd see lights soon. San Jose wasn't that far. But the further I drove, the more it felt like I was the only person left on the road. Every once in a while, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, anything. But all I saw was the faint glow of my taillights dissolving into the void. Then, up ahead, something caught my eye. A shape on the side of the road, barely visible in the dark. As I approached, I realized it was a car, a white sedan pulled over onto the shoulder. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, one of them stuttering. I slowed down, my pulse quickening. Maybe this was connected to the crash. Maybe someone had walked away from the wreckage and managed to flag down help. I rolled down my window as I passed, expecting to see someone inside. But the car was empty. The driver's door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. There was no one around, not on the shoulder, not in the bushes nearby. Just that car, sitting there like a discarded toy. I didn't stop. The road dipped into a stretch of denser woods, and my nerves were fraying. Every sound felt amplified, the hum of the engine, the faint hiss of the tires on asphalt. My hands were damp on the wheel. I turned the radio on, hoping to drown out the silence, but it only hissed static. I shut it off and tried to focus on driving, on the lines of the road, on anything but the emptiness pressing in around me. It wasn't until I spotted the second car that I realized something was wrong. This one was black, parked further down the road. Its hazard lights blinked in sync with the white sedan's, the same weak, stuttering pattern. And like the first, it was empty. The driver's door was wide open, swinging slightly as I passed. My chest tightened as a realization dawned on me. I hadn't seen another moving vehicle since the crash. Every car I'd passed since then had been abandoned. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, and this time I thought I saw movement. A figure, maybe, stepping onto the road behind me. But when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the first signs of civilization. Streetlights, billboards, the comforting glow of a gas station. I pulled in and sat in the car for a long moment, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I thought about calling the police, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what I'd seen. Instead, I filled up my tank, avoided the attendant's eyes, and drove the rest of the way home with the radio turned off and the doors locked. I never read about a crash on the 280 that matched what I saw that night. No news stories, no reports of abandoned cars. To this day, I can't explain it. Maybe it was just a series of strange coincidences. Or maybe it was something else, something I wasn't supposed to see. The highway stretched out in front of me, endless and dark, lit only by the occasional flicker of passing headlights. I wasn't supposed to be driving this late, but plans had a way of falling apart. The accident on the main route had thrown everything off, forcing me onto this back road, one I'd never traveled before. It wasn't an adventure. It wasn't exciting. It was just empty. The glow of my dashboard clock told me it was nearing 11, and I was still 4 hours from home. I was exhausted but determined to keep going. The thought of pulling over on a road like this didn't sit well with me. The silence out here was different, not peaceful, but oppressive. I brushed it off as fatigue. That's when I noticed the car. It wasn't the car itself that caught my attention. It was nondescript, a boxy sedan, dark-colored, nothing special. What made it stand out was that it had been trailing behind me for a while. Not close enough to make me think they wanted to pass, but never far enough to fade into the night. I told myself it was nothing. The stretch of road was long, and there weren't many turnoffs. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. It wasn't worth dwelling on. About an hour later, my eyelids felt heavy and my focus was slipping. I needed to stop just for a moment. The glow of a small gas station sign ahead was like a lifeline. Pulling in, I parked near the entrance and grabbed an energy drink, exchanging polite nods with the cashier. When I walked back out, I noticed the car. It hadn't pulled into the station, but was parked across the road, facing me. The headlights were off, and no one got out. I paused for a second, staring at it. Maybe they were resting or waiting for someone. I didn't know why, but the sight of it made me uneasy. Still, I convinced myself I was being paranoid, got back in my car, and drove off. The sedan followed, its headlights reappearing in my rearview mirror as soon as I hit the road. The next hour passed in tense silence, every turn of the wheel accompanied by the persistent glow of those headlights. By now, I couldn't shake the idea that this wasn't a coincidence. To test my suspicion, I pulled over at a rest stop, one of those isolated ones with cracked pavement and flickering lights. I parked near the restroom, left the engine running, and waited. The sedan slowed as it approached the entrance. It didn't pull into the lot. Instead, it stopped just beyond, idling at the edge of the road. The figure inside was a shadow, motionless. I watched, waiting for something to happen, for them to get out, for them to keep driving, for anything that made sense. But they didn't move. After what felt like an eternity, I backed out of the rest stop and continued driving. The car followed. I was exhausted, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. About 30 minutes later, I spotted another pull-off, a dirt patch on the side of the road. I stopped there, keeping my car angled so I could see the sedan if it followed. Sure enough, it slowed down and pulled off on the opposite side of the road, just far enough to avoid my headlights. This time, I didn't wait. I took off, pushing the accelerator harder than I should have. The sedan stayed with me. Every turn, every stretch of road, they were there. By the time I reached the outskirts of my town, I was done trying to rationalize it. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I called my parents, explaining the situation. Their response was immediate and decisive. Drive downtown and make 4 left turns. See if they're still following you. I did as they said, navigating the near-empty streets in a looping pattern. Sure enough, every turn I made, the sedan made too. Go to the police station, my dad said. Now, the station was only a few blocks away. I didn't hesitate. As I turned into the parking lot, the sedan suddenly swerved and sped off, its engine roaring as it disappeared into the night. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the empty street where it had vanished, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Inside, I told the officers what had happened. They took down the details and sent out a patrol car, but I never heard anything more about it. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they were gone. The next day, I drove past that same gas station on my way to work. It was open, just as it had been the night before, but something about it looked different in the daylight. The emptiness of the surrounding area felt sharper, and the road seemed longer. I don't know why I looked, but I glanced at the patch of road across from the station, the spot where that sedan had parked. The dirt there was marked with deep tire tracks, as though the car had been there for much longer than I had realized. To this day, I don't take the back roads at night. Some people say I was lucky nothing worse happened. I'm not sure I agree. Sometimes the not knowing is the worst part. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. I had just turned 18 and bought my first car, a 15-year-old blue Honda Civic. I'd saved for it for months, working my minimum wage job. It wasn't the nicest car, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. I found it on Craigslist, and the guy who sold it to me assured me it was in great condition. Feeling proud, I called my best friend Stephanie and suggested a mini road trip. Nothing fancy, no real destination, just two best friends on the road, embracing our newfound freedom. The next afternoon, I picked her up, and we hit the road. For hours, we drove through the back roads of Wyoming, laughing, blasting music, and enjoying the open sky. It felt perfect, until it wasn't. About 5 hours into the drive, the car started spewing black smoke from under the hood. Stephanie and I panicked, yelling over each other, trying to figure out what to do. I kept driving, hoping we'd make it to a gas station before the car completely gave up. Finally, we spotted one, a small, old-fashioned station with a rusty sign swinging in the breeze. It was one of those half-gas station, half-mechanic shop places. The building looked worn down, and the surrounding area was eerily quiet. But we didn't have much of a choice. As we pulled in, the car still billowing smoke, a man stepped out from the garage. He was tall and broad, wearing greasy overalls and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Something about him immediately put me on edge. His eyes swept over us, lingering too long, and there was a slow, unsettling grin on his face. "Y'all got some trouble, huh?" he drawled, spitting a glob of brown, tobacco-stained spit onto the gravel. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The car's smoking. Can you take a look?" He nodded, but his gaze didn't leave us. It wasn't the kind of look you'd expect from someone trying to help. It felt more like he was sizing us up. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably beside me, and I knew she felt it too. "Pop the hood," he said, his tone casual but his eyes unsettlingly sharp. I opened the hood, and he leaned in, poking around while muttering to himself. After a few minutes, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag. "Screws on your oil filter came loose," he said. "Oil spilling out and burning, that's your smoke." "Oh," I said, trying to sound relieved, though my unease hadn't lessened. "Can you fix it?" "Sure thing," he said, his grin widening. "Give me about 15 minutes. Y'all can go inside the station, grab a drink or something." Stephanie and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us wanted to stay near this guy any longer than necessary, so we nodded, thanked him, and stepped into the station. Inside, we pretended to browse the dusty shelves while keeping an eye on the car through the window. The whole place felt off, the dim lighting, the silence, and the faint smell of something rotten. "Does he creep you out? Or is it just me?" Stephanie whispered. "It's not just you," I muttered. "Let's just hope he fixes the car so we can get out of here." After what felt like an eternity, the man waved us over. "All fixed," he said, flashing that same unnerving grin. We thanked him, tipped him, and got back on the road as quickly as we could. About 5 miles down the road, the car started acting up again. The engine thumped violently and the whole car shook. "What now?" Stephanie groaned as I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder of the road. We got out to check, but neither of us knew enough about cars to figure out what was wrong. The woods around us were dense, and the sun was sinking fast. With no cell phone and no one else on the road, we were stuck. "What do we do?" Stephanie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," I admitted. "Do we wait? Do we walk?" Before we could decide, we heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. An old, grimy Chevy truck came into view, its headlights blinding us as it pulled to a stop about 10 yards behind our car. Stephanie and I both froze as the driver stepped out. It was him, the mechanic from the gas station. "Oh, thank God," Stephanie said, forcing a smile. "Can you check the car again?" He didn't answer. As he walked closer, the fading sunlight caught something in his hand, a long, sharp knife glinting in the light. "Run," Stephanie whispered, grabbing my hand. We bolted into the woods, branches clawing at our skin as we ran. Behind us, we could hear him crashing through the undergrowth, his heavy footsteps growing louder. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. We dove into a dense cluster of bushes, crouching low and holding our breath. Through the leaves, we could see him pass by, his knife glinting as he scanned the area. After what felt like an eternity, his footsteps faded. Stephanie and I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. We ran until we reached the faint lights of a small town. A kind stranger let us use their phone to call the police. The cops went out to check, but by the time they arrived, the man and his truck were gone. We had a tow truck pick up the car, and my dad came to get us. The car was fixed for real later, but I couldn't bring myself to drive it again. To this day, I don't know what that man's intentions were, but I shudder to think about what could have happened if we hadn't run. That night taught me how quickly something innocent can turn dangerous. Even now, just thinking about it sends a chill down my spine.